We seem to have everybody's attention now. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for tonight's Lemley Family Lecture. My name is Frank Doyle. I'm the 14th Provost here at Brown University, where I'm also a Professor of Engineering and a Professor of Neuroscience. We're incredibly honored to have Dr. Alondra Nelson here tonight, an acclaimed scholar and writer, recently served as Deputy Assistant to former President Joe Biden and Acting Director of the White House of Office of Science and Technology Policy. Very much looking forward to learning from her this evening. The fact that Dr. Nelson is able to join us here tonight stems from the generosity of Wayne Lemley, hence the Lemley Lecture. He was a 1980 Brown PhD graduate who recognized the need for events like this to happen and generously worked with us to make this series take place. Thanks to his support, we have new opportunities to bring exceptional leaders to campus to engage and inspire the community as well as beyond it, including eminent figures such as Nobel Prize winner Jennifer Doudna, writer Isabel Wilkerson, famed journalist and historian Jill Lepore, American biologist Arthur Horwich, and just last year, Stanford chemist and Nobel Prize winner Carolyn Bertozzi. Over the years, Wayne's support for Brown has extended throughout our campus, to the Nelson Center for Entrepreneurship, to the School of Engineering, and more, as well as this wonderful series. The impact of these gifts will ripple out for generations to come. We're truly grateful. Tonight's lecture, How to Govern the Future, Artificial Intelligence and the Road Ahead, will address one of the most pressing challenges facing many organizations today: how to strike a balance between innovation and regulation. It's about unlocking the vast potential of AI while ensuring we approach it with due consideration for ethics and equity. At Brown, we are acutely aware of the transformative role AI is poised to play in the way we teach, the way we learn, the way we work, the way we live. As we define our approach to AI, we are bringing together diverse disciplines: the sciences, arts, humanities, engineering, entrepreneurship, public health, policy, medicine, and so much more, to shape the future of education, research, and responsible practice. We're especially proud to have recently appointed Brown's first Associate Provost for AI, Professor Michael Lippman, who will provide strategic leadership in AI education, research, and governance. Michael brings to the role a strong legacy of work in AI, including education and interdisciplinary research, and is a leading spokesperson in the field, most notably through his work at the National Science Foundation, where I don't think the two of you overlapped, Dr. Nelson, as I just learned, but Michael's deeply familiar with your work. So we're excited about the work ahead here on our campus, and we're really thrilled to be welcoming Dr. Nelson to campus for this very timely and impactful conversation. Before we dive into the lecture, I'm just going to outline for you briefly the agenda for the evening. So after Dr. Nelson's talk, she'll be joined on stage by two of my esteemed colleagues, Professor Prudence Carter and Professor Sesh Venkatesubramanian, for a conversation. Following that, we'll open up the floor for questions from the audience. As you can see, we have microphones in the aisles, and you can also raise your hand if you're in the middle of the aisle, and we can have a mic passed to you. So starting off, I'd like to introduce Sesh Venkatesubramanian, Professor of Data Science and Computer Science, as well as Professor of Humanities here at Brown. He's the Interim Director of our Data Science Institute and the Director of the Center for Technological Responsibility, Reimagination, and Redesign here at Brown. His research interests lie in algorithmic fairness and, more generally, the impact of automated decision-making systems in society. Sesh recently finished a stint in the Biden-Harris administration working under the leadership of Dr. Nelson, where he served as Assistant Director for Science and Justice in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. In that capacity, he helped co-author the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. He will introduce the topic for tonight's lecture and subsequent conversation. Please welcome Sesh.
Thank you, Provost Doyle. I think it goes without saying we're living in interesting times. For anyone who works with AI, it It feels like each week brings a new revolution. One announcement can shift billions of dollars in the stock market or cause geopolitical panic. We live in a time where some of the best guidance on the responsible use of AI is put out by the Vatican and the United Nations. All around us, we see calls for more technological development, more development of AI, more investment in AI. I can't even turn on the radio in the morning without hearing something about AI. I go to get a haircut and end up having a discussion about smart mirrors. My son's school wants to use AI to monitor his communications for safety. The truth is that AI now affects us all, and so it is critical that our needs are central to how we govern it. Professor Nelson, as a sociologist of science, has understood this throughout her career, and that's for much longer than ChatGPT has been around. I had the honor of working with her in the Biden administration, and she guided that administration's work on AI with a very clear and humanistic vision of what rights we, the people, are owed in an increasingly algorithmically driven world. She showed us that we can think clearly and precisely about technology, of what it can and cannot do for us, by bringing it into a socio-technical conversation, one that understands that our imagination and our dreams can help us shape the future that we want, and that the march of technology is not something we need to watch in horror and awe from the sidelines. I came back to Brown with a mission to bring that way of thinking, the way of thinking that I've learned from Professor Nelson, transdisciplinary, informed by machine and human, impactful, people-centered, to the academy. I started the Center for Tech Responsibility here within Brown's Data Science Institute to continue this work, and I'm proud to be at DSI, where we build connections with scholars from disciplines all across campus who are trying to make sense of this AI moment we're in. So it gives me like no end of joy to have Alondra back here and to hear her thoughts. I feel like the circle is closed, or maybe it's not a circle, but a helix that's sort of going forward as it loops. Welcome.
All right, next it's my honor to introduce Professor Prudence Carter. Prudence is the Sarah and Joseph Jr. Dowling Professor of Sociology and the Peltz-Ruttenberg Family Director of the Center for Study of Race and Ethnicity in America. A proud Brown alumna, Prudence's research explores the enduring inequalities in education and society, focusing particularly on their root cause and potential solutions. Her award-winning book, Keeping It Real, School Success Beyond Black and White, critically analyzes cultural explanations for academic achievement among low-income Black and Latino youth in the US. Prudence is a past president of the American Sociological Association and an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Education, and the Sociological Research Association. She is also a fellow of the American Educational Research Association. Her work has appeared in leading journals and featured in numerous national media outlets. Please welcome Prudence Carter.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Frank. And good evening. Good evening. It's so lovely to have you out. I know it's a very cold evening, but I am so excited about this evening's event. Before I introduce our special guest, I first just want to share a note of gratitude and thanks to those who actually made this possible this evening. Thanks to the staff from the Provost's office, from CSREA, from the Data Science Institute, Christy Dos Reyes, Trey Austin Swan, Stephanie LaRue, Zach Leggett, Aspen Stewart Cunningham, Kristen Jones, and Katie Kaperner. Thank you so much. And there are many others behind the scenes, but especially those who had active hands-on in planning this evening's program. Well, they say if you set your intentions, you can bring things to fruition. And this past summer, Professor Sohini Ramachandran and I were having lunch. And we were thinking about how we could actually collaborate through our two centers and institute, the center and institute, And we both realized that we were kind of fan club members of Professor Alondra Nelson. And we said, well, why don't we see if we can get her to Brown? And here we are. Let's fast forward a few months later. It really is my sincere and deepest pleasure to welcome someone whom I call my sister friend, Dr. Alondra Nelson. I don't know if she can recall, but I was thinking about this today of when did we first meet? When did our paths first cross? And I know it had to be about 20 plus years because I have a poster in my study office at home, which advertises a lecture series where we both were invited at Boston College. And we were asked to speak on racial inequality within our respective areas of expertise. And since then, I've had the great fortune to observe her meteoric rise in academia, leadership, and the world of federal and, dare I say, international policy. A scholar of the intersections of science, technology, policy, society, race, genetics, Dr. Alondra Nelson is the Harold F. Linder Professor at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. She's also Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress. Dr. Nelson was formerly, as already mentioned, Deputy Assistant to President Joseph Biden and Acting Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology. And in this role, she was not only the first African American, but the first woman of color as well to lead U.S. science and technology policy. At OSTP, she spearheaded the development of the blueprint for AI Bill of Rights. And in addition to that, she provided guidance to expand taxpayer access to federally funded research. She served as an inaugural member of the Biden Cancer Cabinet. She strengthened evidence-based policymaking, and she galvanized a multi-sector strategy to advance equity and excellence in STEM fields, among many other accomplishments. Including her in the list of the 10 people who shaped science in 2022, Nature said of Dr. Nelson's OSTP tenure, this social scientist made strides for equity, integrity, and open access. Values and principles which I hope and pray many of us who lead integral institutions and organizations will continue to embrace and stand up for. Dr. Nelson is also the award-winning author of widely acclaimed books and articles, many of them which have been translated into various languages. She's the author of The Social Life of DNA, Race, Reparations, and Reconciliation After the Genome. She's also the author of Body and Soul, The Black Panther Party and the Fight Against Medical Discrimination, Genetics, and the Unsettled Past, The Collision of DNA, Race, and History, with Keith Wailoo and Catherine Lee. Of course, with all of this incredible accomplishment and many contributions to the Academy and to the policy world, she's also the recipient of numerous prestigious awards and honors, an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, the Council on Foreign Relations, and an elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the American Academy of Political and Social Science. In 2023, Dr. Nelson was named the inaugural to the list of the inaugural TIME100 list of the most influential people in AI, and appointed to the United Nations High-Level Advisory Board on AI. It is my incredible honor, my pleasure, to introduce and welcome to the podium Dr. Alondra Nelson.
So 3 introductions. Thank you all, Provost Doyle, Suresh, and Prudence, my dear friends. Thank you to the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America, the Data Science Institute, for the invitation to be here. I'm deeply honored to be here also under the auspices of the Lemley Family Lecture, and thank them for their support. And so I'm going to I'm mostly looking forward to the conversation, and so I'm going to try to not take too much time with my remarks, and we'll see how that goes, because, you know, this is a kind of wild and fast-moving space, and I think those of us who've, you know, watched the news over the last month, I think there's still lots that I'm trying to process and learn, but I'm going to tell you a kind of a philosophy, like how I think that we can begin to as individuals, as organizations, I think that this applies to organizations, and as a society, begin to think about fast-moving technologies. Forms of AI tools and systems are, in some regard, probably the least of it. We probably have quantum information science coming, bioengineering, biomanufacturing, lots of other kinds of iterative dynamic technologies coming. And I think it requires, in some ways, a different philosophy of thinking about governance, and that's some of what I want to talk about today, this evening. But I want to, let's see here. There we go. Oops, went too far. Just begin with, just to level set with a definition. This is a definition and we all have a voice and a say in how they're used in our lives. And so I start with this brief definition that is a kind of very general purpose definition. That's not a technical definition, in part because I think it's very important that all of us feel like we have a stake and also an entree into this conversation. So what is AI? Machine-based systems that take various data inputs, right, and make outputs based on those data. So the outputs can be things like so-called predictions, things you might be familiar with. So, you know, predictive patterns, you can track them in things like supply chains, like, so how many widgets have we sold over the last year, and therefore how many widgets might we be able to anticipate using various forms of sort of machine learning technology to help us know more about that. Other forms of AI are recommendations, right, a recommendation system. So I'll allow you, depending on how you think about your Netflix recommendations or your Spotify, to think about how, you know, useful and powerful you think AI is as a recommendation system. Decision-making suggestions. So one example of this is in real estate. So large management companies like RealPage and Greystar use an automated system called YieldStar to help them set prices. And there's been some accusations from the Department of Justice to fix prices in ways that are unfair to consumers, for example. Most of you are probably most familiar with AI that outputs content, generative AI that outputs content as its output. So that's using deep learning and machine learning techniques to interpret large amounts of data and also sometimes neural networks as well. And then more recently with things like DeepSeek's R1 or OpenAI's O1 Mini or O3 Mini, we're talking about reasoning, which are large language models effectively that can take a bit more time, use various kinds of chains of thought and reasoning to reply to a query that you might submit to them. These systems vary in their level of autonomy and adaptiveness after they're deployed. Some are static, others are iterative, so it's a large kind of suite of tools and systems that we're talking about. But fundamentally, machine-based systems that take inputs and generate outputs is what you need to know. I think it's also really important because so much of how AI has become important for our broad public conversation happened in November of 2022 when ChatGPT was introduced as a commercial product to the world for the very first time. So those of us who work in tech policy, who work in computer science, we're familiar with some earlier versions and iterations of ChatGPT, GPT-2, for example, knew that chatbots were becoming increasingly important in this space. But this was really the first time that you had a consumer-facing product. And I think part of our attention, our aspiration, our fear, our awe, our shock around AI it was that moment that you had a consumer-facing tool, not just something humming in the background of, say, a recommendation system. So I think it's really, this is a graphic that I worked on with Sesh for another presentation, but I wanted to present it here because in our imaginations, in our imaginaries, we think that all AI is generative AI, right? All AI is ChatGPT. But I think when we're thinking about AI and AI policy, it's important for people to understand that it's a subset of much broader fields that do a lot more in the world. And so that means that if we're thinking about things like AI for good, and you might be familiar with AlphaFold, which is an AI program that was developed by Google DeepMind that predicts the protein structure and we hope might lead to kind of novel drug development, among other things. So the developers of this, John Jumper, who's now at the University of Washington but was at DeepMind, and Demis Hassabis, a founder of DeepMind, received the Nobel Prize for chemistry this year for AlphaFold, which is now in another iteration, but this is an early iteration. And I think there was a lot of confusion in the reporting because people assumed that it was a large language model, right? So this is actually deep learning, right? So this is AI, it's a deep learning model, and it's not a large language model. So it's a way in which AI is sort of impacting our lives, and one of our sort of hopes for it is around, our big hopes for AI, or AI for good, such as it is around potential healthcare applications. So why do we care about AI? In part because we think it might do transformative things in the world. So AI for science, one application that I've already mentioned to you. Another example where it's already having some beneficial applications is AI for accessibility. So this is a screenshot about a London-based company called Waymap that helps visually impaired people navigate their surroundings. You can use it indoors, you can use it outdoors. It's used in a lot of subway systems. It's also a really important example of universal design in that it was initially intended for people who had forms of impairment, but it's actually really useful for all of us as we're navigating in space, and it's become a really, I think, really important use of AI that's expanding. And then we might think about AI for productivity, right? So that's large analyze on this is through, shining light on it, use body camera images for engagement with the public and police. What Professor Eberhardt, who's a psychologist at Stanford, has shown is that there's just caches of data sitting in police departments that nobody has ever analyzed. So we have these police cameras, nobody's actually looked at the data. So what she's done is gotten permission to transcribe this data and to use large language models to do some analysis from this data. And she's been able to show where there are kind of patterns in language that suggest that an interaction is going to get heated and might lead to, a kind of suboptimal outcome for the person that's been stopped by the police. So, our AI for good applications are also for ongoing kind of social challenges with regard to things like police violence and police public interaction. So these are the things we hope for, but my message for you this evening is that AI for good any be stewarded by the way that we structure them in systems, the way that developers use them, the way that we build them, the ways that we build guardrails and laws around them. And we're seeing that it's not inevitable, these good outcomes, because we have a lot of outcomes that are indeed not good. These are just some headlines that I conversations I have with people at different organizations where they feel like they're being left behind. But I want you to understand that the usage rates are still growing, that people, everyone, believe it or not, in your life is not using AI all the time, and that part of those misgivings are because of their, that we've not created a trustworthy kind of ecosystem for these technologies. So I just wanted to show you, this is Pew Research Center, which I think many of you know does some of our best survey research on the internet and society more broadly, but this is on AI. So this is from about a year ago. And here the point I want to make, this is the share of employed Americans who have used ChatGPT for work. And they note that it's risen by double digits, right, for tasks at work, to learn something new, and for entertainment. But I want you to appreciate that the rise is, it might be a rise of 100%, but you're still looking at only 20% as the height, right? So we still have kind of very low penetration of use of generative AI in American society and in the workplace. And so, so I think that we need to sort of think about this data as we're thinking about the hype about the introduction of Copilot to sort of every software suite in every community and every office, et cetera, and whether or not, what that actually means. I'm going to show you two more slides. Sorry, there we go, from the Pew Research data. So this is concern about artificial intelligence in daily life far outweighs excitement. So this is from 2001 to 2003. So you would have expected that people would be sort of more excited and less concerned, but the data doesn't do that, right? So as you go from 2001 to 2003, 2022 is when ChatGPT is introduced, you have more than 50% of respondents in this survey are more concerned than excited. And so the growing exposure to AI, particularly after that November of 2022 moment, makes people, there's evidence that it makes people more concerned and more apprehensive. And lastly, this one's a little bit harder to see, but Americans widely oppose employers using AI to make final hiring decisions, track workers' movements while they work, and analyze their facial expressions. So opposition to using it for a final hiring decision, to tracking workers' movements while they work, 61%, keeping track of when office workers are at their desk, keeping track, recording exactly what people are doing on their computer, so a sense of surveillance in the workplace, analyzing employees' facial expressions, tracking how often workers take breaks. So again, if we think that part of what we hope that AI might bring beneficially is efficiency, we can put that in quotes and sort of define it in an academic sense, productivity in the workplace, the fact that workers are very concerned about the introduction of this should give us, I think, pause, and I think should make us want to govern these tools, introduce these tools, frame these tools, and use these tools in ways that can begin to instill confidence for people in them. So the last data I wanted to show you is just from the most recent Edelman Trust Barometer, which is less a survey and more kind of public perception, but they've been doing this survey for a long time. Last year, they did their first introduction of questions about AI, and they did it across several different countries. So resistance to AI stronger in developed markets is the headline here, but the question was, do I reject the growing use of AI or embrace the growing use of AI? And what's, I think, quite striking is that the 50% or higher reject the growing use of AI are in sort of Western developed countries, right? The US, Australia, the Netherlands, the UK, Canada, and France. Where you see, 50% or more, I embrace the growing use of AI, only one country at 51%, which is China. So, so not only do we have in the United States, I think, a lot of work to do to make the adoption of these tools and systems more widely adopted, but we also, sitting in the broader, this is not the entire world, but sitting in a kind of broader ecosystem of thinking about other countries, it's also the case that skepticism in the United States and in the so-called developing world is extremely high. So what are we going to do about it? If we think that these tools are useful, potentially beneficial, how are we going to think about it? How do we govern the future? bans. I want to talk in my retaining time this morning a little bit, as I said at the top, about what I think is the kind of philosophical approach that we need to think about how we want to govern AI. We want to make the rules for how we want to introduce and use these tools and systems in our communities and our institutions. Important because policy understanding of how that decision was reached. So I offer this for you, this was something that we did in the Biden administration. It's no longer part of the current administration's work, but what I'm offering here for you to think through is the principle of it. Like, just because AI is introduced, it does not mean that that employment discrimination laws don't apply, or laws around fraud and the ways that we've thought about laws around trade don't apply. Those still apply with regards to AI. We also want to think about the ways that existing governance applies, and I want to offer you one example of this. So this is the State of Illinois' Biometric Information Privacy Act. This is an act that was started in 2008. Illinois is the only state that grants residents the right to sue over businesses' improper collection and mishandling of their biometric data, whether it's an employer or customer, it doesn't matter the role. What Illinois legislators did very smartly is that even though this was introduced in 2008, well before we had anything like ChatGPT, they wrote the law in such a way that it applies to facial recognition technology, it applies to other forms of AI uses of AI systems and tools, which is to say that we don't always, sometimes we will need new legislation, but sometimes we actually need to just be willing to be a little disenchanted with our new tools and think about how they apply to the social world that we're in and the social world that we want to have. That said, there may be instances in which new governance may be needed, and we see examples of that. In the last California legislature, Governor Newsom signed 18 bills into law that were related in some way to AI. He did not sign into law, if those of you are tracking SB 1047, which we can talk about, he vetoed that one, but there were 18 other laws that had something to do or say about AI. For example, one established heightened consent requirements for the use of digital replicas in the media and entertainment, given the important role of actors in creative fields in California, for example. Just today, a California bill was introduced, the Automated Decision Safety Act, that takes up, it's a new bill, it's this third introduction of this bill, but it does two things. It offers new legislation, and the new legislation is to say that is to sort of authorize existing regulatory bodies to use their powers to apply to AI. So it's a kind of combination of using existing laws and sort of pressing forward with a new law that makes them more powerful. And the premise is that, most of all, that anti-discrimination laws apply to AI. How else do we make kind of new laws and new governance? I want to remind us of the important work of workers and of social movements in creating governance for the future. So you will remember last summer the Screen Actors Guild and the Writers Guild of America strikes. And I think that when ChatGPT was introduced, or 5 years ago, or 2 years ago, if someone had asked you, how are we going to be developing employment law, thinking about AI? And, someone might have said, well, we're going to need to get all the best computer scientists and all the best labor economists and, think it through. And, we probably need to do some of that, and some of that is happening. But it's also the case that you had creative people, who created the world's first, as far as I know, the world's first employment action against, with regards to AI, and did so successfully. So both of these strikes ended with concessions from employers around the use of people's, how they could use their writing, whether, and the use of their images, the use of their voice in the case of actors. And so these will last for 4 to 6 years, the length of the contract. But I think that we should, I take heart, and I think that we should take heart by the fact that, people who are, English majors and poets and the like, really understood that they didn't have to be computer scientists to understand the stakes of AI for what it would mean for their employment and for their creative work, and were able to do something about it. So one of the ways that we can govern the future is to be willing to, as I said, be a little bit disenchanted and to sort of, be clear about the stakes of what these tools mean, and be willing to do something about it. Those are the top two images. The bottom two images are from the National Nurses Association, who are also engaged in trying to figure out how exactly we're going to use AI not to replace nurses, but to augment that work, and what does it look like, and what does liability mean in those instances, and how do your loved ones who are being cared for with nurses who are using kind of algorithmic systems, is that the experience that they want? Is that the experience that's a healing experience? And moreover, some nurses just flat out say that that AI is degrading their work. So we're seeing ways in which we are coming to have kind of challenging contestation about the use of these tools and systems, and these labor struggles are one of them. And of course, we also have lawsuits. And so the outcome of these lawsuits, should people like the actor John Grisham win, these are lawsuits against OpenAI for accusations that they, in the case of sort of crawling the entire internet for works, also maybe violated copyright or IP of writers like Grisham. So they could certainly lose this case, but they could also win this case, and that would be creating kind of new law about how we think about the relationship between AI and IP. So I offer all of these for you as sort of live, active, living ways in which we are thinking about how we govern AI as a counterpoint to the narrative I think that we often will receive in the media, which says that nothing can be done and nothing is being done. So again, all of these might not be successful. The next time the Writers Guild of America has a contract renewal, they may not get any concessions with regards to AI, but this is an active space, and it's a space that's not fully determined and that can still be shaped for beneficial outcomes, beneficial uses of AI. Part of what the challenge that we face is that it might be the case that creative people want to, you're facing kind of the extinction of your work, you know, you've got to actually sort of be able to have other conversations about how you might engage with these tools in your work. All right. So I want to offer to you one other pillar of this kind of philosophy of how to govern the future, and that is to embrace iteration. So it is certainly true that to create policy, whether again you are a school or a federal government, around technology and around things like generative AI, things like AI reasoning systems that build out of large language models, it is the case that making policy around these technologies is different from making technology policy around a car or a toaster, right? On the one hand, we want to get to basic consumer standards, the same as we have for a toaster, which we don't yet have for AI. So let's get there. But we also want to appreciate that these tools are dynamic and iterative, and that the laws or rules that we might create around them may not last and stand for all time, and that should be expected and okay. So working in Washington, as I did, you know, you come to learn that people working on the Hill, senators and our representatives, our elected officials, often believe that making a good law or a good policy is something that stands for 10, 20, 30 years, right? That for many generations of lawmakers was what it meant to make a good regulation, right? So if you think about the last time we really did regulation around anything having to do with the internet, it was probably the Communications Decency Act that was in 1996 that gave us Section 230. That was over 30 years ago. We've not really done policy since then. And there was a sense that, and I think there probably is still a sense that that law should just stand, right? But it's clear that when you have dynamic systems, we might have to reimagine that. So how do we want to think about that? I think that we should think about policy making, if not, it might be harder in the sort of formal regulatory and legal space, through the framework of what we've had to do with standards for things like cybersecurity, right? So this is the National Institutes of Standard and Technology. I love to use the NIST example. I think there are other examples because NIST is one of the federal organizations, federal agencies that's actually in the Constitution, right? So this is an organization that's over more than 100 years old. The ways that we had weights and measures and early trade in the United States come out of the work of NIST. So NIST is really meant to do this really important work that's not supposed to be iterative, actually. That's supposed to be kind of solid standards for, this bale of hay weighs, gives you this much gold, those sorts of things. But what NIST has had to do, beginning with cybersecurity and now also with their risk management framework for AI, is to do versioning much like we do software versioning. And I think that that kind of versioning is a way that we can think about in organizations how we do policy that can still be anchored in, I think, foundational kind of values and principles that organizations should not waver on. Like, you don't, just because you introduced AI doesn't mean you need to change the charter of an organization necessarily, but there will be things that need to be more dynamic. So I offer you here the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. This is a version 2.0. Just an example of the risk management framework that came out in January of 2023 with the version 1.0, with the expectation and the implication that this standard would be dynamic. It wouldn't stand for all time, and that one of the ways that we can think about doing AI policy is to anticipate that it might need to change. All right, so I think the last pillar of this kind of what I hope is a kind of philosophy for you of thinking about how to govern AI that maybe kind of opens up, I think, some of the ways that we get stuck when we are left listening only to sort of company PR about these technologies, or also only to our highest aspirations for what they might become in 10 or 20 years. These are hopefully a bit more practical ways that we can think about how we can make these tools useful for the things that we want them to do. So this is prying open the black box, right? So the black box is, you know, that thing that sits between the inputs and the outputs. Sometimes we have some insight into what's happening there, sometimes we don't. But part of the way that we've also come to, I think, govern AI is to engage in forms of practice and research, kinds of red teaming, kinds of civic teaming that are attempting to do what the companies often will not do and open up for the public some of the challenges and things that we still don't know about these technologies. So I'm going to just offer 3 examples in closing. One is a widely known research paper by Joe Buolamwini and Timnit Gebru and others that suggested or that demonstrated that facial recognition technology was biased against people with darker skin, and particularly women with darker skin, and that the algorithm wasn't sort of working in the same way across all populations. And so that work was done by, looking at the sort of training data and by doing their own analysis of it, by actually sort of mirroring back to the companies independent analyses of, third-party auditing, red teaming, as you might call it, of the work that they were doing. So in the end, one company stopped doing these techniques, and then the others corrected. So Amazon corrected their system. They went from, somewhere in the 80% accuracy to somewhere in the 90% accuracy. We already have deep research obviously was just introduced by OpenAI, and so there are already public evaluations of these tools are happening. This is one from this week from Science that Derek Lowe did, that are beginning to kind of probe these systems, again, in the absence of kind of standard safety testing that we might expect from other tools. And so one of the ways that we govern them is by, I think, naming and shaming in some instances where the tools don't work, and really trying to offer the testing that the companies aren't doing. Another example I'll offer you of this is some work that, let's see if I'm getting my clicker work, work that I did, some research I've been doing with the journalist Julia Angwin that we call the AI Democracy Projects, in which we've built software that draws the APIs from 5 different chatbots simultaneously and poses the same query to them. We worked with lots of incredible AI experts, and also, importantly, we had to work with subject matter experts as well, bipartisan election officials from all across the United States, because what these systems output was information that sounded completely plausible about where an election polling site is in your community, or whether or not you can vote if you have, a misdemeanor arrest or a felony conviction in your community and the like. And it really took people who were actually from these actual districts to be able to answer these questions. So this is really, it's hard work. It's, I think, work that I think those of us at universities can feel, and research institutions can feel a little bit resentful of, because we're having to, kind of follow behind companies who didn't do kind of adequate research and do it for them in some instances. And I think I enjoy doing this research. I think many of us enjoy doing adversarial kind of red teaming and other kinds of testing around these systems. But, I think we do have a fundamental question about what happens to university blue sky research when so much of our attention is being turned to kind of correctives of what the companies have done. That said, this is one of the critically important kind of tools or levers that we have for right-sizing these technologies. So I would offer you that as the kind of last pillar of how to think about how we might govern AI, and I welcome our conversation.
Right, well, thank you for that. That was amazing. We have a lot of questions, and I'm sure we have questions from the audience, so we'll have a bit of discussion here, and then we'll open it up for questions to the group.
Sounds good. Yep. Okay.
So many things to ask. You've brought up so many points. I want to ask you about open research, to end with the part you mentioned here about the role of blue sky research, the role of opening up the black box, right? You've championed open science at the White House with the publication of the Nelson memo. You've weighed in on policies around open access to the most advanced AI models. You mentioned DeepSeek and something. How do you see the role of open science, especially in regard to, say, community participation involvement in the advancement of technology?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I think what I didn't have time to say here that's worth mentioning is that we have had a real transformation in the research ecosystem, so that we're sitting in the middle of, and the AI transformation is sitting in the middle of that. So it used to be the case that only universities did research, or mostly universities did research, and you had a few places like Bell Labs that also did research, but it really took place in universities, and we had that that sort of paradigm of commercialization. So you do R&D, you'd get applications, and then someone in the private sector would take them and commercialize them. It's now the case that research is being done a lot more in the private sector. The National Science Board puts out a report every 2 years called the Science and Engineering Indicators, and there's an amazing chart from the report that came out of March of last year, what suggests that, shows a significant increase in the percentage of research that's being done in the private sector, but that comes with lots of implications, and so that means that you don't have the standard kind of scientific approach, right? So you don't have, you might have peer review sometimes, but are people sort of refuting? Do you have an hypothesis? Are you testing a hypothesis? Is someone refuting it? Can someone, test what you've done? Sometimes that's the case, but often it's getting a product good enough to ship it, and it works well enough, and we'll get it out in the wild, and we'll see if it works well enough. So I think that's created a whole different. It's scrambled the research ecosystem again a little bit, and it's made it, I think, all the more important for, I think, us to really be committed to open science, across sectors to the extent that you can, which is getting more difficult because in the private sector you're dealing with proprietary information or claims of proprietary information. So, so that's really a challenge, and I think that we've got to sort of. I think it's very important for research universities to really keep that scientific method, open science, being able to show your work, have others share your data to the extent that it's possible. Sometimes data can't be shared is important. And then, related to that, during our time working in Washington, we tried to evolve a policy that had been made in the Obama administration, which I'm trying to use the kind of, what's the legal, I'm thinking of like a lawyer sitting over my head. What is the kind of White House legal lawyer term? I think it's not required, it's not mandated, it's suggested that federal agencies, make federally funded research available to the public as soon as it's finished. And not have this 12-month embargo. And, that was I think a couple of things, that was very much, you take a responsive to the pandemic and to things that happened during the pandemic in which we made science more open and available to people so researchers could do it, so we could understand it. It was a very fast-moving science. And also entering into a world of just kind of growing distrust of science and of research. And I think, the sort of theory of the case here is everyone's never going to trust government fully, or they're never going to trust scientists fully, but to the extent that you can make the research and show people what their taxpayer dollars were spent on, and we're living out some of that right now, that might sort of help to sort of begin to sort of patch up some threadbare trust. And so both commitments to open science, but those are also commitments to, I think, a more democratic practice around research.
Yeah. So as I listen to you, and first of all, thank you so much for sharing and informing us so deeply. One of the things that I couldn't help but feel was the tension between futurism and pessimism, or technological advancement and humanism, thinking about civil rights and inequalities versus what could be beneficial and what could be reduced or advanced. And I want you to wear this your sociology hat a little bit, particularly when I think about some of the issues in the black box, but some of the issues of bias that you raised, right? And there's, some of the work you've done at the White House was also around equity in STEM fields. And one of the things that we know, and some of the questions that were already pre-selected, is there are a lot of people who really doubt this kind of technological advancement because of the adverse impact on certain bodies and certain groups of people. And so I want you to just talk about that a little bit more, about what would be needed to actually reduce, in terms of representation, or if it's in terms of the actual science and the coding. Well, we know it's the coding, right? But I don't want to go to Amazon and my face not be recognized, right? Like, that's a problem, and then that can become a collective problem, that can become a civil rights problem. That's why a lot of people are pessimistic about it. So one of the blueprint or standards for your blueprint that you developed was around civil rights, individual civil rights. What do you think we need to do in this moment where it's almost where there looks like there may be a little bit of regression? Is that a euphemism?
That's quite a kicker for the question, right? It's like, where are we going with the question? Lots to say. So you're always going to have, there's a fundamental thing is that there's all data is going to be biased in some way. So that's just a fundamental challenge of data. Something's always going to be missing. Unless you create a perfectly balanced synthetic data set, something's going to be missing. Things are just not going to be fully represented. That's true in social science research as it is in computer science research. So that's just a fundamental thing. And then you bring in the person who selects the data, the person who frames the data. All of those are moments of what we might call bias, right? In which decisions are being made about how data is cleaned, about how data is labeled, et cetera. So I think that's a fundamental truism. And then, you said about the futurism and the pessimism. I was a STEM kid. I work in science and technology policy because I think these tools are cool. I really actually are, I'm endlessly kind of captivated by what we're able to accomplish. But I also, the part of me that's a social scientist just knows that we can expect more, that we are being given choice architectures and frames around technologies that don't have to, and they're naturalized in a way that we think about them in the social sciences, and they don't have to be naturalized. And so how do you probe around the framework that you're given to think about how these tools potentially might be better, it might be better for people. The question that you ask about, facial recognition technology is a particular distinct problem that has particular biases that I think are more than some other uses of AI aligned with the ways that we think about racial inequality. So I think it's a particular use case that is available for that particular critique and for the prying opening of the black box around that issue in particular. I think it's a hard problem. I mean, we have. It certainly does not help that the private sector is being encouraged to not have diverse teams, to not have teams that can anticipate or at least articulate some of the sort of decisions that are being made in the creation of these systems. But I also believe that we can just do better. I mean, one of the analogies I use when I'm talking about AI, and people say, oh, well, if you have regulations or guardrails or laws or norms, like you're not going to have good technology, or it's not going to be great. And I think part of why I often will lead with the kind of values anchor piece, those fundamental things that, everyone wants a fair shot. That's a truism, wants a fair shot in life. And I think anchoring in that allows us to then say, well, how do we build technologies that allow us to do that? So the metaphor I often use is around basketball and Steph Curry, and in that, there's no Steph Curry without a three-point line. So I often think about innovation as and sort of responsible, ethical innovation as that three-point line. Like, who are going to be the developers that are actually going to really do true innovation that allows us not to have to give up even an inch of the things that we value about our society, and still have tools that are help us to be more productive, healthier, safer, and the like.
She's not kidding about being a STEM kid. I still remember a phone call. I was walking back from the Washington Zoo to Georgetown, and we were on the phone talking about cryptocurrencies and how they work. I still remember that.
Putting everything on the blockchain.
Yeah, everything on the blockchain. Yeah. Treasury on the blockchain.
Everything on the chain.
But you've seen you've been at the center of discussions on AI, not just at the highest levels of the U.S. government, but at the world with the UN. You've been seeing what's happening in AI all across the planet. And AI discussions are not just a US discussion, no matter where we might be going now. They're all over. And you've been at the safety summits, you're going to another ones. Can you tell us what AI governance is looking like across the world, and perhaps where we can be hopeful in how we see that happen?
This is a really interesting moment. So I'm going to the France AI Action Summit, which takes place on Monday and Tuesday of next week. And it is going to be the third. So there's been the Bletchley Park, the London AI Safety Summit. There was a Seoul Summit in the spring, and then this one. And there's been lots of other kinds of convenings and gatherings besides. In addition, as Prudence mentioned in the introduction, I was part of the UN high-level advisory body that released a report this fall at the UN General Assembly called Governing AI for Humanity. So, it's a hard space because it's such a space of geopolitical contestation. And on the one hand, you have the United States, which up until maybe 2 weeks ago was the clear by far leader in this space, was driving the space, and could, I think, take a role that was wanting to kind of bring the rest of the world on, but kind of really on our terms, because this was an industry that we created. This is our kind of our technology, our innovation, and I think so. The challenges that you have in the international space are that they're never not competitive. Even as people talk about wanting to do more for people and the planet and all of that, there's always this kind of sort of undercurrent of that deep competition. So I think, certainly with the UN work, it was 38 people from, thinking about nationalities more than kind of 40 different countries. And I think where we got to a place across all this competition, and there was a colleague from Russia, there were 2 colleagues from China on the committee, in which I think we agreed at the level of particularly of science, that there should be, the world should, no individual country or member state in the UN, including the United States, can make good policy decisions around AI if there's not some common base of understanding about what it is. And so part of that international AI report that I mentioned to you is kind of contributing to that. Sort of what does the scientific evidence say? What does it not say? And, how can we proceed from there? But there were other things like, should there be a global fund, that we're disagreement upon, to kind of support the distribution of kind of more AI, training, human capacity, and these sorts of things. So it's a pretty, it's a very unequal space, but it's also the case that lots of countries besides the United States have, like colleges, like universities, have AI strategies that they are trying to actualize. And the strategies that I've seen have been things like in Nigeria, the technology minister there, sort of having a diaspora strategy. So sort of saying, I may not have in Nigeria right now the world's greatest AI scientists, but all over the world are Nigerians who are the world's greatest AI scientists. So how do we think about, bringing them on board? You've got places like Singapore that are thinking about, that are already leaders in fintech, thinking about how to do that, already leaders in sort of knowledge work and these sorts of things. But I think as we saw this week or the last 2 weeks with DeepSeek, AI is also an adversarial space, and so there is, I think, some sentiment around kind of sharing knowledge in the space of science, and there's deep competition, including in the United States itself.
So one of the questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience, that I would love for you to speculate on, and particularly with your international work, the chart you showed where there were less developed or emerging countries, emerging economies and such, there's more hopefulness or optimism and around it. And you just mentioned Nigeria, and there were a few other African nations at that end of the spectrum as well. What's your sense? Is there about why there is more optimism in those places as opposed to the more the OECD countries, the more advanced democracies, and in some ways, is it about inequality?
In part, I think. I mean, we don't know. So so the Edelman data doesn't have, it's not backed by lots of qualitative interviews that would allow us to drill down. But I think we can make some good inferences, some good guesses. I mean, partly, we see often in the developing world the kind of leapfrog ability. So if you think about a place like Kenya and you think about fintech, you go from kind of not really having a banking infrastructure to being able to use mobile banking, right, as a way that leapfrogs things ahead. So I think there's some of that. I think, certainly with China, China has, for good and for not, very clear kind of policies and guidelines around uses for China, and some of them are not half bad. I mean, some of them say, AI systems should, abide the Chinese Communist Party kind of rhetoric, but a lot of them are, that you should not be discriminated against with an AI system, for example. And so I think the China explanation is much more about, I think a much more authoritarian community that says we're going to use these tools and everyone is using them. But I think to your question, part of the explanation is probably about inequality and about being able to use these tools to, thinking about large language models, for example, to, write resumes, to, just to sort of really accelerate the ability to, I think, move about in a broader world in a way that's potentially more productive.
Yeah.
Let's open it up to the audience. There are 2 microphones, and on the side, if you can line up behind either one of them, then we can call you out one by one.
Hi, thank you for coming. Oh, wait.
And if you can introduce yourself very briefly when you do that.
Yeah, I'm Nicole Gonzalez Van Cleve. I'm a sociologist and a big fan. This is a problem happening everywhere, but I can only speak to what's happening at Brown. I was shocked when people handed in their finals and I realized one student had plagiarized my work with ChatGPT. I was like, wow, this is so good. Wait a second, that's me. What the? But then I didn't even know, at this point I thought, how do we teach through this? That's the first stage question. Many of us are going back to blue books. And I think there is a generational issue, which is my elder colleagues, boomers, they're having trouble spotting AI, Whereas myself, like if you're an elder millennial and younger and the TAs are awesome, like boom, I knew it was a robot. Like I could feel it. I knew it. And then we have detection software that's failing miserably. We have an international student, bless him, he was working so hard, and he was trying so hard with the English, and so he basically wrote all his own ideas, and then he said, make me sound like a Native American speaker. And I said to him, what happened here? And he said, yeah, I did. I used it. I just wanted to improve my English, and we talked through it, and he was lovely. But it showed the failures that we were having, and I even talked to our dean of students, and that's now become a case. So can you help us navigate this terrain? Because it feels scary, and it feels like if we're not ahead of it, then this next generation, I'm talking about young people.
Yep.
My son's already saying, why do I need to go to school anymore? I could just ask ChatGPT things. And I'm like, some of our college students are feeling that same shortcut.
Yeah.
So how are you teaching your students and thinking about that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
A couple things. That's a great question. One, I wish that instead of having a race to market, that OpenAI had spent a month, 2 months before shipping their product and spent time with K-12 teachers and college and university professors to help create systems for how you would use these tools. So you recall, I didn't put I could have put in one of my news headlines, the New York City School District bans ChatGPT. Imagine having a tool this interesting and having school districts having to ban it because they got no advance notice. We can imagine, if we want to imagine different futures, we could have imagined a world in which, that companies worked with teachers, and when ChatGPT was introduced, there were modules. There were we could imagine a whole different world for how this happened. So that didn't happen, and we're stuck with the world we have. We do have to learn how to teach differently. So I might have an unpopular opinion here, but I think it should be okay for someone for whom English is not their first language to be able to query, to use Claude or something and say, copy, edit this for clarity, do not change the sentiment. Part of it is also how you prompt the system, because if you put it in there, it's just going to put it into like Claude speak or ChatGPT speak. But you can kind of constrain like what you ask it to do, like just to make it more clear. Don't change anything else, for example. But I think we also have to think about different assignments. So, even things as we were talking about the scientific method or how we do our work. Even things like citation is changing. So a colleague of mine who teaches at Georgetown encourages students to use chatbots and to use large language models in their work, but we have the issue of citation, like how do you cite it? So his response has been, print out the prompt and the answer and attach that to the back of the paper, and that becomes the citation. I can sort of see, what you gathered from that. And then I think we do have to do work that is about teaching students how to think critically about these tools. So, I would point you to the AI Democracy Project piece that I did with a bunch of other colleagues, because the answers look right. They look completely correct, but they're wrong. And so I think we need to build into students and to all of us, actually, just a general skepticism, the kind of skepticism you would have even if you're like on TikTok or you're using social media, that kind of just like, is that true? Is that, did somebody pop that hit on that body? And like, did that person actually say that? There are ways in which we have skepticism, and we don't have that about chatbots because they feel so plausible, so authoritative. The language is so smooth. So I think we need to have a whole cluster of different kinds of tools, ways of using these tools. But I would also go back to my talk and say, I'm really sincere when I say that it should not be the case that your code of ethics still applies, right? So cheating is cheating. So the job of us is to help to figure out, we have values as an institution. How do we interpret those values with these new tools? The values don't change, right? But how do we need to think about that? And so I think that's still the work that we're kind of doing as institutions. But I don't envy you. It's a hard problem, but I think the answer is not to tell students not to use the tools. It's to figure out how to incorporate the tools into the classroom in ways that help them use them, and ways that are ethical and that are helping them to build critical thinking skills.
And based on Nicole's question, it sounds like it's not just the students who need guidance, but the professors do as
Yeah.
well. Yeah. Next question.
Hi there, my name is Keith Ritchie. I'm an alumnus of Brown, graduated a few years ago, but currently work in the AI practice at Paul Weiss in New York.
Yep.
I wanted to touch back on DeepSeek as part of in the broader context of what you've been talking about today, and also add like a few other points on the
Sure.
US side in recent months. So this wound up getting a little bit buried, but this past week, time flies so quickly. But Google also just like abandoned the prohibition against developing AI for weapons and
I
surveillance.
saw that. Yep.
A few months before that, OpenAI began partnering with Palantir's sister company, Inaugural. Meta is, I believe, also working with DoD. So my question is really, like from the background that I'm bringing and the context of your policymaking, is how do you regulate AI as something that is a consumer good, it's a productivity tool, something that really penetrates a lot of aspects of our lives, while it's also increasingly being recognized from the capabilities development side as a geopolitical resource of pretty big significance?
Yep, love this question as well. So this is one of the big challenges that we face. I mean, we have in the sort of legal literature or legal parlance or policy parlance, this understanding, this sense of dual-use technologies, right? The technologies that can be used both for commercial purposes and for military purposes. And particularly with generative AI, you have just not only a dual-use technology, you have something that's also called a general-purpose technology. Like part of the AI, like fairy dust, is just like, we think large language models can do everything, which they can't, but they do have broad uses. So if you think about something like GPS, which was developed by DARPA, developed as a military technology, and then the government, the federal government sort of exercises its role as a kind of internal precautionary principle and then says, we're going to now make it a commercial product and we're all going to have GPS in our cars. So that's a dual-use technology. That sort of a decision was made by the state to sort of, make it commercially available. The challenge that we face now with highly capable artificial intelligence technologies is they can simultaneously be used for one and the other, and you don't necessarily know if someone's using a chatbot when it tips over into being kind of potentially dangerous or not. So I think that's just a general, challenge that we face through the paradigm of the dual-use technology that we're wrestling with right now. The other thing I would say in answer to your question is there are huge government contracts to be made around these technologies. So if we think about, folks who are older than you, my age, and older, you can remember a time when the introduction of the personal computer happened, and the introduction of the personal computer into institutions took place maybe, let's say, over a decade. And so you had certainly huge contracts with school districts, with the federal government, with Dell and other kinds of computer companies. What you're going to see, what we're seeing with AI is much more accelerated. So it's going to be huge contracts tomorrow, and it's not going to be sort of disseminated over the course of a decade. And so these are huge competitive contracts that I think there's a lot of competition over. And moreover, a lot of the concern and a lot of where the big contracts are going to be in the military space. And, clearly, a lot of actors in Silicon Valley are directly competing with Northrop Grumman, with Boeing. I mean, that there's a real kind of, in the business philosophy sense, it's an attempt at disruption of that conventional, I think, defense contractor model. And that leads us to partnerships with Palantir and Adderall and, these sorts of things, which, I think the Google, Google already had a challenge with their employees around Project Maven. I mean, I'm not on the Google board. I don't have anything to do with Google, but, I think scholars writing about Google will certainly, I think, reflect on an erosion of kind of foundational founding principles of that organization as it comes to do this other kind of work and to really embrace, sort of military applications of AI.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, and in spite of all the questions we have, I think we're almost at time, and I think.
Can we just grab them all and do like a?
Yeah, if you can quickly ask your question, then maybe we can do a quick round. So,
Yeah,
quickly.
we'll answer them all at once.
Yeah, it's just for the question, very quickly.
Sure. Yeah, then I'll just skip the introduction and say thanks for the great talk. So I think what I'm most interested in is how technical work, more research, academic work in how AI works, how it interacts with policy and how it informs your policy. So I'm really interested in what kind of technical work do you feel will be most high impact for policymakers? And for example, what type of technical work are you most excited about?
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I'm a PhD candidate in Black Studies, and I'm feeling this kind of intersection between Afrofuturism and Afropessimism. My question is about ethics and sustainability. My field and the communities I work with are a little suspicious of AI. They bring up the extraction of materials in Congo. They bring up the negative impact on climate change. They bring up suspicion about the intellectual merit of folks who use AI-generated content or editing services. So I'm wondering, can you provide a kind of generic, maybe brief script that I can bring back to my communities where I can say, hey, there's some potential here. We should look into Black studies and data. We should think about Black STEM a little differently within humanities departments. How do I challenge these kind of suspicious accusations?
Thank you.
Hello, I'm a junior at Brown. I had a question about kind of how you envision the distribution of AI around the world. So, for example, DeepSeek follows Chinese generative AI laws, which violate other laws. And we can see that Europe has had a very conservative approach. So I'm kind of wondering about whether you see technology being kind of this national thing or rather an international technology, and whether that's going to either increase the gaps or is the technology going to be used to kind of use it as a level playing field?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm a freshman here at Brown. I'm just interested in how AI is kind of accelerating corporate consolidation in some ways with a small amount of big tech companies kind of controlling the most powerful large language models. And I'm wondering how we can navigate that with policy and how me as someone who's trying to look for a job for the future kind of think about it and navigate my own career.
Yes, these are amazing. These are all amazing questions, actually. Okay.
Got to give another lecture.
You have 30 seconds, Alondra.
So technical work that impacts policy. I mean, let's see what happens with the U.S. AI Safety Institute, which was established and was sort of framed up in President Biden's executive order on AI and was started a few months later in the Department of Commerce. So far, it still exists. There's one in the UK. I think there's a Japanese one, Australian one. There was, in November of this year, a meeting of this international network of burgeoning kind of AI safety institutes. So that research is interesting because it's on kind of safety in a kind of very conventional sense and capabilities, but it's also on applications and uses because, to the question that the colleague asked here from Paul Weiss, you often don't know capabilities unless you're talking about a particular use case. And so there's both kind of almost sociological, socio-technical research that needs to be done around taking this particular model, if you're talking about a model, and then what does it mean at the application layer then to use it in these different kinds of contexts. And so I think all of that work needs to be done. We still need to be doing lots of, I think, red teaming and different types of ways of trying to figure out what's going on with these systems. I have colleagues who are mathematician colleagues because they're mathematicians at the Institute for Advanced Study who are doing some of this work. We're thinking about the foundational mathematics of neural networks and of foundation models. I mean, I think those of us who sit in universities really need to refuse, the narrative that we hear from companies, which is I don't know how these things work. We can't possibly know, right? Clearly they are very complex and it's going to be hard to fully know. But that's really, when I go back to what I was saying about the choice architecture, that's a choice to ship a product before you know more about it, right? And there's all sorts of incentives to do that, but let's not accept that we literally do not have a clue and cannot know. So those I would offer those as some suggestions. On ethics, sustainability, climate, the script. I mean, I would say the script is like, you're right. Where's the young person? Yeah, part of the script is like, yes, you are right. But it's also the case that there are like important, applications and use cases, like, helping people, being able to use a chatbot to do a resume. If you don't know how to do tabs and all of that, I mean, like what a chatbot can do, for example, with a resume, I think is pretty great. And to do a cover letter and these sorts of things, you have those kinds of applications. You have all sorts of creative applications, some of which will, I think, rub up against, people's ethical positions when we have to think about how the models were rendered and where the data comes from that allows them to be, Sora and DALL-E 2 and all of that. But I think that they're not wrong. And, my work, it was and is precisely about that tension and about thinking and appreciating and acknowledging and honoring communities of color, Black communities, as both really important and I think insightful critics of these spaces and also often important innovators in those spaces. And so I would say your script to your communities is that you're not wrong, and but there also might be some interesting things that we might want to do with these tools as well. I mean, this is the issue, they're both, it's all happening at the same time, right? So there are both these kind of national sovereignty claims. We have heightened claims around data sovereignty, heightened claims around, wanting to have sovereign AI, national AI. Even the UK, I think, has used that phrase for a technology that, even before DeepSeek, already had lots of open source models, right? It was already, there are, the UAE has 2 models, Falcon. There are several Chinese models already. There were, models in the United States in addition to Meta's Llama 3. And so, where the genie's sort of out of the bottle, and it will be interesting to see, what happens if, how it evolves, right? I mean, how the internet evolved was, these kind of different communities working with Linux and kind of, that more kind of community-based thing. I'm not sure that you're going to see that with AI, but I don't know. I think it remains to be seen. But I think that fundamental tension, because of a lot of what, some of the kind of geopolitical competition that I mentioned earlier, remains, and it creates these, I think, these weird contradictions. So for example, and I'll talk about the US context, we have, I don't know if they're formally export controls, but I know during the Biden administration that, that sort of an executive order was issued that said that data brokers shouldn't share, American data with countries of concern. With sort of adversaries. But sort of I think to what I take to be the core of your question, what does that even mean? Actually, like how do you keep data and national borders? How do you, when we have a broad political economy around the selling, procuring, and shipping of data, how does that become a kind of national project in a way? So I think there are fundamental things around data and clouds and these sorts of things that both encourage, I think, a sort of desire to have strong control via export controls and other things, but as we saw with the DeepSeek model, also push up against them in ways that sort of make it difficult to accomplish. Accelerating corporate control, yes. I mean, that's the world we live in. I think if we think of one way I often think about it is if you think about the evolution of a company of Meta, and you think about how that company's grown over a decade plus into, a platform and one of the, largest, most successful companies on the planet. So that took place over time, but now you've got, OpenAI and Anthropic that, like, over the course of 2 years, although OpenAI has been around for longer than that, and but are going to sort of potentially accomplish that same outcome. And so it's certainly a consolidation of power and of capital, but it's also, I think, to your point, an acceleration of that as well. What to do about that? I mean, I think I think the Biden administration was right to lean into antitrust, and, you know, into the work that Lena Khan was doing at the FTC, to the work that, you know, our friend Rohit Chopra was doing at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, all of whom, again, were using levers that were in, like, pre-AI levers. They were pre-Chat GPT levers, right? But levers that were still useful for helping us to, you know, balance out trade, keep marketplaces more diverse, you know, push back a little bit on monopoly. So, you know, I don't know what else we do if we don't have those levers, but we're going to have to figure it out.
Okay, on that note, thank you once again for coming along.
Alondra, thank you so much. All right.